Hi, everyone. Meteorologist Bill Rentschler and meteorologist Carmelo Lattuca in the 1011 Now streaming studio, bringing you another edition of the Weather Academy. Carmelo, it's been a couple weeks. We've had some schedules, things going on since we've been able to do our last segment. But you have been very excited, specifically saying you wanted to be here for today's segment.
This is a very important topic. This is a severe weather hazard that, you really can't escape from,
Mm-hmm.
If it happens in your area, you're going to be impacted by it. And it's really just one of those few times I can, say the word gargantuan and constantly say it, and reference it about hail. So I think it's just a very fascinating weather phenomena.
It is. And as we get started, I want to tell a story, though, because, again, we get plenty of hail here in Nebraska. And again, I haven't got it already, but we're talking about hail today.
Yes.
But we get plenty of hail here in Nebraska. But the hail capital of the world, it's not that far away from us. It's actually northeastern Colorado, southeastern Wyoming. The amount of hail they get there, it's not necessarily the biggest all the time.
Right.
And so when I lived and I worked in Cheyenne for 2 years, that was one of the big adjustments that I had to make, because you're at an elevation. And you're also still in a spot where you still get plenty of thunderstorms. If you're in the mountains, say, you may not get as many big severe thunderstorms.
Right.
But when you're on the foothills, just off the Front Range there, you still get plenty of severe weather. And you're still, anywhere from 5,500 to 6,500 feet in elevation. And so, sometimes we'll get hail, but it'll be real small. Or sometimes, you get those really big, fat raindrops.
Okay.
A lot of times those are hailstones, but they have had time to melt.
Right.
As they fall. In, again, places like southeastern Wyoming, northeastern Colorado, the Panhandle, they just don't have the time to melt because you're at elevation. And so one of the things I had to get used to in Cheyenne was they would have feet of hail. They would get out their snow plows.
So it looked like snow.
It would look like snow. You would have a foot and a half. And, it was real small, Dippin' Dots, maybe pea-sized, real small hail. Wasn't necessarily doing tremendous amounts of damage.
But it was everywhere.
But it was, yeah. And, they literally, again, you would have to, scoop your sidewalk from the hail.
What's the largest hail you've ever seen out there?
Oh, out there? Softball size.
Oh, my God. I've never seen anything larger than a golf ball. So, the difference alone between that is...
And just holding it in your hand, it's just... And again, hail is very common.
Yes.
Large hail, though, again, you have to think it's falling in a thunderstorm, a very small space. So not necessarily everyone has seen really big hail before.
No.
Before we really dive in and kind of talk about what it is and how it grows and stuff like that, one of the more memorable hail events here locally in Lincoln, if you go back to 2016, especially the southeast part of town, and again, this hit my parents' house. It was softball-sized hail that impacted the southeast part of town. And so my parents' house, if you look at my parents' house, the inside, it's older because it's an old house. The outside, it's less than 10 years old because they had to get, and many people in that area, had to get new roofs, new siding, new gutters. My parents had to get all new windows. They had to get a new air conditioning unit, because the hail was so destructive.
That is incredible that happened. And it can happen anywhere, populated areas. Obviously, it's going to happen in rural areas more often, but incredible that happened, less than 10 years ago?
Yeah, 2016. And so, yeah, the outside of the house looks great.
It looks brand new.
Yeah, brand new, less than 10 years old. So, we're going to do a deep dive into hail today. Again, Carmelo, you put together our presentation today.
Yes.
I'll let you start with your little background here, because I know you were very...
I was very excited when I found this title slide, PowerPoint, the designer aspect of it. All hail starts off as water, or it's precipitation, we got rain that evaporates into the cloud. We're going to talk about the process of what happens inside the cloud and how it falls and stuff, but hail is basically just, giant pieces of ice falling from the sky.
Mm-hmm. It's cold up there.
It is cold up there.
And so it very easily, again, we see that water freeze and then eventually grow.
Most
definitely. So, again, these are just some examples of large hail. Again, this is a slide, if you've ever been fortunate enough to be in one of our presentations in the schools, you've seen this slide before. But, again, just some of the and this isn't even necessarily the biggest hail, but you got a windshield that's just getting pummeled and getting broken. The middle video always makes my heart hurt just a little bit because it's a golf course in Minnesota.
Sounds like you have a better chance of getting a hole-in-one on that course.
I mean, yeah, you maybe do, but and it just does a tremendous amount of destruction. And then again, the last video there, that's down in Texas. Again, just look at the pool. The hailstones falling in the pool. I did have to check and make sure the cow did find some place to go.
Yes.
Again, I probably should have picked a different video before showing it to the school-age kids. They were very concerned about the cow. But again, even this isn't necessarily just the biggest hail. And again, what I always like to say is, in Nebraska, most everyone's connected in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a relative, a grandparent, or something like that, to agriculture. And so hail, tornadoes are bad, straight-line winds are bad, but hail and straight-line winds can just do a tremendous amount of damage to crops. And again, farmers especially really don't like hail because it can strip, the corn stalks, fresh new plants that are, just sprouting or stuff like that. It can just devastate entire fields because you don't even necessarily need huge hail. But if you have hail and you have 60 or 70 mile an hour winds that come with it, it can just shred those fields.
No, tornadoes are destructive, but they cover such an isolated area usually. But hail, I mean, that could cover, many miles, and they really can destroy some very important crops.
Mm-hmm. So take us through, Carmelo, the basics here.
So the basics. So hail, as I said, in its most basic form is ice falling from the sky, but it's an opaque or white ball of ice, and sometimes you're going to see it with layers, and we'll talk more about the layer formation in just a second. But on the basic end, it forms through convective processes, through thunderstorms, usually larger than 5 millimeters in size. It can range from peas, which non-severe hail, and we'll talk about the sizes of hail and what we mean by severe hail or significantly severe hail, but it could be up to the size of grapefruits. Now, that's some very destructive hail.
Yeah, again, just imagine a softball piece of ice.
I can't even imagine that. And the fact that you've seen that is crazy.
Yeah, no, it's something to behold. So again, we could really get into the minutia here of how hail really grows. There's several processes in which hail can grow, but probably the most common kind here is kind of what you see displayed here on your screen. And so basically, all hailstones start with something for this ice to develop on.
Right.
Whether that's a piece of dust, evaporated salt or sea salt,
Absolutely.
Or something like that. So some sort of nuclei
that can freeze upon.
That it can freeze upon. And so that's then how it begins. And so then it goes through this process of basically it's in this updraft of the thunderstorm.
Correct.
So again, you're very high up in the thunderstorm. So again, very cold temperatures, allowing those water droplets to freeze. And then this hailstone basically is bouncing up and down above and below the freezing level in this thunderstorm. So it goes through this process of melting and refreezing and melting and refreezing, and it bounces up and down. And as it does so, it's not only colliding with other raindrops and other potential hailstones, so it's gathering this coating of water, and that's how it continues. As it then refreezes, it gets a little bit bigger than it was the time before.
So you saying that, I'm sure people are imagining the larger it gets, gravity eventually has to bring it on its way down, but the updraft speeds, now these are the speeds that are being pushed up into the thunderstorm, are sometimes so strong that it's going to push these softballs essentially back up into the storm. They can grow a little bit more before they finally make its way down to the surface.
And this updraft, I mean, again, you have this updraft. We'll talk about the updraft speeds here in just a second, but it's not necessarily a constant speed.
No.
It's not like if you had, your leaf blower and you had it
right, just
the button
facing straight
down.
up.
And so it's not just this constant speed. It's wind. And,
yes.
And wind kind of ebbs and flows a little bit, so you'll have a really strong updraft, and maybe it weakens and that's as it weakens, that's when it falls, but then it gets stronger again, so that's when the hailstone gets thrown back up in the air. So like you mentioned, the rings, and you can kind of see in the image here some of the rings, and they kind of look like tree rings on a tree that you can see develop. Not on all hailstones. Some of them, again, like you mentioned at the very beginning, are really opaque, and you can't really see much, kind of like the image you see on the top of the screen there. But a lot of times you can see rings, and so you can kind of almost see how many times this hailstone has gone through this process of melting and refreezing. Again, kind of like tree rings on a tree, where you can tell how old a tree is. But eventually, again, like you said, Carmelo, gravity always wins eventually.
Yes.
And so as soon as that hailstone is then just too darn big to be held up in the updraft, that is when eventually then it falls to the ground.
Absolutely. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think most people think of hail as very spherical. Sometimes we see hail that's very, jagged and, has like spike kind of shapes on it. Is that due to the collision between?
I mean, you have a bunch of collisions, and again, you're in this space where there's a lot of just motion, and it's not uniform. So there's vortices, and so this hailstone is not, it's tumbling on top of all this, and so you can get some very round, very smooth hailstones, but again, you can also have hailstones that are very jagged, or more of an oval type shape, maybe like an egg, things like that. So that, again, and that also goes into there's different ways that it can grow, accretion and things like that. And so, but generally, it's some sort of spherical shape.
Yes, absolutely.
And so we'll actually punch over here, Carmelo. So this, again, basically is just kind of a little video form of what we just got done saying. So you have that updraft, and again, that hailstone constantly bouncing up and down. And so then eventually the weight exceeds the force of the updraft, and that's when the hailstone will fall. So just a little animation there of how that hailstone actually falls to the ground. And so this next part here, Carmelo, is always what I still have trouble really wrapping my head around this part.
It's
But
something
these are the
really crazy to think about.
Updraft speeds that are required in a thunderstorm to produce different hail sizes. And so severe,
yes,
you need 1 inch diameter hail. So take a quarter out of your pocket.
Right.
That's an inch. And you're talking, you need
winds about 50 miles per hour.
50 miles an hour. And again, but it's 50 miles an hour straight up. When we hear and we think wind, we think horizontal.
Right.
But, we're talking park that car, flip it up, and go straight up that way. And so I always, whenever we're in the schools, I say, you've ever been on the interstate or the highway with your parents, and you're driving 50 or 60 miles an hour. Now imagine you're driving 50 or 60 miles an hour straight up.
Yes.
And it doesn't look that way when you look at a thunderstorm off in the distance. But there's actually an updraft in there that can be 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 miles an hour, straight up in the air.
And I think it's quite interesting that the wind speeds vertically match up with how destructive the wind speeds can be horizontally. For example, you have baseball-sized hail that requires about a wind speed of about 81 miles per hour. I think we all know in Lincoln what 80-mile-per-hour winds can do. We saw that over the last month or so.
We did.
And grapefruit, you're almost at 100 miles an hour. So very destructive hail, larger and stronger updraft speeds.
And so, again, then it makes sense. Obviously, the bigger, the more powerful the updraft, the bigger, more powerful your thunderstorm is just going to be. And henceforth, then, the bigger, potentially, your hail is going to be in that thunderstorm as well. So again, it's still something, again, to this day that I struggle with, even sort of like 100 miles an hour straight up in the air. But again, also at the same time, it makes sense because we see these thunderstorms off in the distance, and we can see, we step outside, maybe we see it, and then 20 minutes later we come back, and all of a sudden it's poof, poof, it's way up, and that's because there's an updraft that's that strong within that thunderstorm. And so sizes, and again, we just talked about this a second ago, Carmelo. But again, 1 inch, that's what we need for a severe thunderstorm.
Right. You can have hail with a thunderstorm, and we won't issue, or the National Weather Service won't issue a severe thunderstorm warning. If you're only seeing pea-sized hail, that's not really going to cause any damage. It might be a nuisance, by any means, but it might make it look like snow on the ground, but it's not going to cause really any damage. Once you start getting a quarter-sized hail, you can start maybe seeing chips in the windshield, stuff like that, maybe some dents onto the car. Now, when you get up to 2-inch hail or bigger, now we're talking about hen egg or like lime-sized hail, that's what we call significant severe hail. And that's going to cause some more destructive capabilities. And eventually, tennis ball, 2.5 inches, baseball, 2.75, get up to softball, 4 inches in diameter. That is just exceptionally rare and quite crazy, to be honest.
And so, in Nebraska, we see pea probably to tennis ball.
Yes.
I would say on a fairly regular basis.
I think so as well.
Once you get bigger than tennis ball, that's when it doesn't happen quite as often. It still happens every single season.
Yes.
And even softball to grapefruit, it happens every single season, but it may only be a handful of times. It was just, I think, 2 weeks ago, I think it was up near O'Neill, they had softball-sized hail,
yes.
4-inch in diameter hail up there. And again, thankfully, most of the time in Nebraska, if we're talking about hail falling, it's generally falling in a rural area.
Right.
So it's not necessarily, again, which still can do plenty of damage to crops and things like that, but it's not necessarily falling in a major population center.
I don't know if I've
Nebraska.
ever seen a warning in Nebraska with grapefruit, and that's probably just, my lack of time being here as long, but that would be incredible.
It catches your attention because, again, one of the
Yes.
things the National Weather Service will do is, again, they'll issue warnings based on ground truth. What are the reports on the ground? But they'll also look at the radar and what the radar could be indicating. So a lot of times, and they'll update the warnings as time goes on. So a lot of times you may have a warning that says, hey, it may start with 60-mile-an-hour winds and 1-inch hail, but then 20 minutes later, it's 70-mile-an-hour winds and 2-inch hail. And then another 20 minutes later, all of a sudden, it's 4-inch hail.
Yes.
Because that thunderstorm continues to grow, and all of a sudden we're getting ground reports that, like, hey. And that's one of the nice things, too, about social media nowadays, is folks can take a picture
It's pretty much
and say,
instantaneous.
hey, this is the hail I got in, southeast Lincoln, tweet it at the Weather Service, and now the Weather Service can take that ground truth, and they can update the warning to say, hey. And a lot of times in the warning text, too, they'll say whether it's radar indicated or whether it's observed.
Right.
And so that's some of the things that you just want to listen for when we try and communicate the information is whether it's radar indicated, we could see really large hail with this, or like, hey, we're actually seeing this reported on the ground.
And the great thing about that, too, now is, it's not only tornado warnings where we're going to get that, loud notification from our phones, those notifications that they send to the cell phone carriers and you're getting it straight to your phone.
Wireless emergency alerts.
Wireless emergency alerts. It's 80-mile-per-hour winds now or anything greater than that. And I believe it's 2-inch hail or anything greater than that. That's why we say we go from severe from 1 to 2 and then significant severe from 2 plus. And, a little bit more of an advanced warning.
And so what we've been talking about is what we see in most cases.
Yes.
But what about what we don't see in most cases? And this is an example. This is the radar loop of a thunderstorm that produced the largest ever hailstone in the United States. And it fell in not too far away from here in Vivian, South Dakota. So just off to our north, and this was back in 2010. So again, you see on the radar that storm, it's got some pinks and even some whites on the reflectivity. So again, indicative of a pretty intense updraft, pretty intense storm there as it's moving from west to east across parts of South Dakota and eventually hit Vivian, South Dakota. And Carmelo, I'll let you tell everyone how big this hailstone is.
This hailstone was pretty big, but it has an interesting story behind it.
Well, tell them how big it was first.
So it was 8 inches in diameter. So if we're talking about 4 inches the size of a softball, we're to double that, and it's basically the size of a 2-pound bowling ball. Can you imagine a bowling ball falling from the sky and what kind of damage that would leave? Even if it didn't hit anything, I'm sure it would leave, and it did leave a crater in the ground.
The crater.
But yes, this happened July of 2010. But the interesting story behind it, if you don't mind me telling
please.
is that this happened, I think somebody saw it in their backyard, and he brought it inside. He called the National Weather Service, and he said, I found a pretty big hailstone. I think this is, this might be bigger than normal. And I'm sure he saw it, and he's like, this is not something that happens every day. They told him, put it in your freezer. Unfortunately, they couldn't get there until the next day.
Power went out.
So we can imagine that there was a little bit of melting. We don't know how quick he put it in the freezer, how much, how quickly, it melted inside of his freezer, but I can imagine it was a little bit bigger than this.
At least a little bit.
But this still holds the record.
8 inches in diameter. It does not hold the record for circumference.
No, for diameter, yes, but not circumference.
Circumference is actually, I guess I probably should have double checked before we came on, but I'm pretty sure it's still held by a hailstone that fell in Aurora, Nebraska in 2003, and that circumference, it was 7 inches in diameter, and it was 18 3/4 inches in circumference, which again, for those who maybe are a little rusty on the math, the circumference is just measuring it all the way around. So again, almost 19 inches in circumference, weighed almost 2 pounds. Again, that could do a tremendous amount of damage. And again, that gentleman had reported he had numerous hailstones of at least 6 inches in diameter, and he just picked the biggest. And these are the pictures the Weather Service actually went and took when they documented this hailstone when it fell. And again, it fell in July. So it fell.
Yes.
It's probably, I mean, I imagine with a thunderstorm like that, the temperature probably got knocked down to, into the 70s. But again, you're still well above the freezing line.
Right.
So likely melted a little bit on the ground. And then in the freezer, also could have melted just a little bit since the power went out.
It's just incredible.
It is. So that is, that's one of the big ones. So one of the questions we get though a lot when we talk about hail is because there's multiple different kinds of frozen precipitation.
Yes.
And there's hail, there's sleet, there's grapple, there's ice pellets, and it's really all kind of the same thing. It just kind of goes through a different process.
It's all about the temperature profile in the atmosphere.
And so take us through the big difference.
So I'm sure you've heard us say temperature profile a lot of times, and we're going to say it plenty of times. I can only imagine come the winter season, but it's all about the temperatures above the surface. So we can have precipitation that starts off as frozen, melts into rain, refreezes before it hits the surface. That is going to be our sleet, also known as ice pellets. There's this thing also called grapple. It's just a different sort of melting and refreezing process in the atmosphere. Hail, though, doesn't have time to melt. It's moving too quickly. Temperatures might be warmer, and they're going to generally be warmer than what they are up in the cloud, but especially with those larger hailstones, they're not going to have time to fall down, melt in the sky, or above the surface, and then hit the ground. So basically the big difference is that refreezing and melting process. Sleet, typically clear, very small. We don't see it anywhere near the size of hail usually. And hail, though, from pea size to softball size, and usually has that kind of irregular shape too.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes if you go back and look in the record books, the almanac, sometimes in June, July, or August, the almanac will say there might have been a trace of snow on a certain day. Not actually a trace of snow. It hailed that day. And somehow it ends up getting put in the record books as a trace of snow. I'm not sure how or why that happens, but
that doesn't make me feel very good.
So, but yeah, hail. That's kind of the deep dive into hail. Again, thankfully, we haven't dealt with much of it. I don't think this year. We've dealt with more tornadoes this year than necessarily.
There's no doubt about
hail.
that.
But again, that's just kind of some of the basics for hail. So 8
Absolutely.
inches though in diameter for the biggest one ever.
Bowling balls falling from the sky.
Yeah.
Can't even imagine that.
2-pound bowling ball. Again, 2 pounds doesn't sound like a lot.
No, but when it's coming down, how
like
fast is that coming down?
I mean, that'll kill you. That'll kill you. So again, hail is one of those severe hazards. Get inside.
Yes.
Take shelter. Also, I'll add, sometimes you're out driving and you run into a storm and there's hail. And if you're on the highway or the interstate, folks maybe want to pull over underneath an overpass.
Mm-hmm.
There's always, people think sheltering under an overpass is always a good idea. Whether it's rain, hail, tornadoes, whatever it might be, it's not a good idea.
No, never a good idea.
Because you and potentially a bunch of other people are probably going to have the same idea, and you're going to want to take shelter underneath that overpass. And all of a sudden, you could have 4, 5, 6 cars parked along the side of the road underneath that overpass trying to get out of the hail. And then all of a sudden, you've created kind of a hazard underneath the overpass where you have cars coming in. If there's a thunderstorm, maybe there's a lot of rain, visibility's not great, and all of a sudden you could be potentially putting yourself in a bad spot and
Absolutely.
others in a bad spot if they can't see because of that storm and you're sheltering underneath that overpass.
I couldn't agree more.
So just better to kind of try and get through it as best you can.
Yes.
I know it can be difficult sometimes.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah. So what do you think we're going to talk about next week?
I was just thinking the same thing. I might have to pull up that list real quick if you can, but I don't know. We've done severe weather each time now, and I'm not opposed to doing another severe weather topic, since we are entering the fall season.
We are entering the fall season. And probably one of the things we probably could have talked about, probably could have done it today, is just the seasons in general. Like
meteorological fall
seasons,
right?
Because we just started meteorological fall.
I'm not opposed to doing that next week.
Maybe we'll do meteorological seasons.
Yeah.
That's something.
When's astronomical fall?
Yeah, it's going to be like September 20th or 21st.
Okay, so I mean we'll be a week out from that,
Yeah,
a week
so
from
maybe-
the start.
maybe-
So we'll be
maybe-
in the middle of both. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, maybe we'll hold it for that week, but we'll figure out something.
Yeah.
So.
Something more fall-like, I think. It's going to be in the cards.
Yeah. So we appreciate everyone for tuning in. As always, again, this is a weekly segment that we try and do. Again, sometimes the schedule means we bump it just a little bit, but there is a live stream schedule that lives on 1011's website, so you can check that to kind of see if we have it planned for the week or otherwise if we have it maybe bumped to a different day or maybe we're just not going to be able to get to it that week. But I appreciate everyone for tuning in, watching as always. Again, we do this segment live. Right now we're on 1011 streaming platforms, 1011now.com, our Apple TV app, Roku, Fire TV, all that stuff. Also live on YouTube as well. So anyone watching on YouTube, I would appreciate you like and subscribe, turn on those notifications. We do a ton of different weather stuff. Again, from the streaming desk, again, daily forecast every morning right around 9 o'clock, just a little update in there. So a ton of different stuff kind of happening from here. And again, if you want to look back at previous segments that we've done, again, we've touched on tornadoes, Cape, and the Cap. Now this segment, you can find that on our YouTube channel in the playlist. You can also find it on 1011now.com. If you just search in the Weather Academy on 1011now.com, that's a place you'll be able to find it. So, Carmelo, thanks again, as
of course,
always, for helping put together that presentation. And we'll have to figure out what we're talking about next week.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of these days we're gonna have to do some, Husker weather trivia. We're starting to get into that too. I'm sure we could make a presentation on that.
I mean, it's already too late now. I do have a spreadsheet of
Okay.
the weather for all of the Husker home openers.
Okay.
I have it broken down to we've had this many games in the 90s, 80s, 70s.
Yes.
How much it's rained. I think it's rained on about 50% of Husker
opening.
home,
Yes. It's
home
47%, I think.
Something like
that. Yeah. It's a coin toss.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. So, all right, well, appreciate everyone for tuning in, watching. As always, again, keep it tuned to 1011, both on air and online, for all of your latest sportcast needs, as well as all of your latest news and sports.